Do we just start? Is it rolling?
Yes, it's okay. You can start. Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to Philoxenia, to Kreisky Forum. Thank you very much for coming tonight, everyone who came here because although we are all completely, I can't even say a whole sentence without stuttering tonight, we are all so exhausted and worried about the war in the Ukraine. Everyone is, I think, doesn't sleep well anymore. And so it is almost a miracle that we are here today, and we're very, very happy that we have guests, because we always wanted to come back in March in full speed and power to overcome the pandemic. So at the moment, we haven't even overcome the pandemic. You know, half of the city is sick now. But we still have to go on and do other things than just worry about war and pandemics. And we are very, very happy to say hello to our guest tonight, Azadeh Moaveni. Welcome to Kreisky Forum.
Thank you so much.
We were planning to have this special talk tonight because it's the 8th of March. It's International Women's Day. And although I personally always have mixed feelings towards Women's Day, when I lived in Russia, all these women always get flowers, and people come and give you flowers, and on the next day they start beating up their women again. And it's a very sort of, I have very mixed feelings towards this day. But actually, if you look at the origins of International Women's Day, it's a very important day to also raise consciousness for the problems that women have and what they have to go through. And I think we have to actually sit with this kind of crossing our arms, because the special, if you can do this, please,
yeah,
also,
shall I?
because
okay.
that's what we do for
okay.
today, 8th of March, 2022, right. Is,
oh,
yes, it's sort of against bias, and I think it means sort of also an inclusiveness that we don't judge women just because they look differently, but we sort of take everyone into our debate, and everyone should have equal rights, even if they live in cultures where they don't get them. So this is why we are here, and we want to talk about your, all your work, but in particular, we have this book that I read with amazement. You know, it's just an incredible book. It's called Guesthouse for Young Widows. And you have written it, it was published 2 years ago.
Yes.
And it follows the biographies. It's a really, really important and such a tricky subject also, because it follows the biographies of women who joined the Islamic State in Syria, not as fighters, because of course the radical Islamists don't take female fighters, but they joined them as wives, and they ended up, most of them, as widows in refugee camps somewhere, either in Syria or in Turkey, and often without having the opportunity or the option to go back to the countries that they were originally from. So we want to discuss this tonight, what implications it also has for all of our governments, and what you are advocating to do, because not only are you a very well-known bestseller author and journalist, your other books were Lipstick Jihad, and you have written extensively. Your articles are published in The Guardian often, but also in other American journals, New York Times, etc. And you are now working in the International Crisis Group, which a group that sort of deals with exactly these kind of tricky moments when crises occur and human rights and citizens' rights are not being kept up. Is this sort of a good description?
It's
of your oeuvre, of your work.
It's
and
fantastic. No, it's very generous and kind, so thank you. But yes, absolutely. I think sort of how women are impacted by conflict and how young women and their aspirations, their horizons, their potential to kind of participate fully in their societies has been a really early theme of my work from when I started out reporting, even the Iraq War, the invasion of Afghanistan, throughout all those years. I always had an eye to how women were experiencing war and how young girls were experiencing war. So I think it's absolutely a great summation because I write narratively about these things because I think an audience that finds so many of these places foreign and very different can relate and understand the politics better through personal stories, or at least through an entryway. Personal stories is an entryway. And then now, alongside that, yes, I do this this policy research that that very much involves the same dozens of discussions about with women in communities and in contexts where they're impacted by war, but kind of brings the lessons or the implications for a policy audience, which is also, after years of just writing for the media and writing essays that are meaningful to me and perhaps, engaging for others, being able to have specific ideas about how things might be able to change structurally in our response to conflicts. As we're all kind of gripped with what's happening and unfolding in Ukraine. That's a very welcome kind of chapter in approaching the same things, but in a perhaps more immediately impactful way.
But how did you sort of come to this topic of looking especially at the women in this ISIS context? Was this something that was interesting to you from the beginning?
Not really, to be honest. I arrived at it very accidentally, almost. I'll tell you how the story came to me, or what attracted me to it. I have been a Middle East correspondent for many years, but I was living in the UK when all of this began to unfold, and I was teaching university teaching university in a part of London where there were a lot of students who were the first generation in their family going to university. They were often from, ethnic minority backgrounds, and a lot of young women from Muslim backgrounds. So, when I would take the bus into work, half the bus would have the hijab on. And when the girls from London who went to go join ISIS disappeared, the thing that I reacted to was the way that they were described in the media. They were described as prostitutes and concubines and whores for the caliphate. And I found it really shocking because these were, girls from similar backgrounds to girls that I was teaching. They were very young. They were, some of them in high school. They were at an age where they couldn't. 15, they were 15. So the media coverage of these girls specifically wounded me. I thought, wow, I come from, a family who comes from another place, and I, think that I'm Iranian or British or American, and I can be all these things at once. And the way that they were written about, as though they weren't British anymore, was so distressing to me. I thought how quickly you can have your other identity taken away from you if you do something wrong, or if you make a terrible mistake. How can you lose something that you're sort of born into and you think is your right, your nationality? So I wanted to find those girls. I wanted to find those girls and see why they had done this, and I wanted to write other stories about them, or trying to make what they did understandable. And so it was really those girls who I went after. And then it was in the course of searching for them that I met so many of the other women that ended up being this book, and I realized, wow, there's a whole sort of side to this organization, the Islamic State, that at that point I felt hadn't been really adequately recognized by my colleagues in the media. I thought, wow, they're really putting women at the very center of everything they're doing. I mean, they're mobilizing men by promising them wives. They're mobilizing women by promising them membership, with other jihadist groups didn't do. They had gender strategies for everyone, and I thought it was incredibly cunning. And I didn't think that that was part of the way that ISIS was being conceptualized or discussed. So between these two things, I sort of had a project, and then that sort of led me to what became, all of the research that became the book.
I mean, when we think how we were sitting in London or people were sitting in Vienna, and you saw this sudden trend emerging. And of course, we were mostly focused on the young men who left, because we then saw them decapitating Western hostages. And that was sort of the initial stage of also shock and horror, that often these people who went there were partly from Southeast Asian backgrounds, but they were also from sort of, if you want, British families, or German, or, the converts to Islam who didn't have a family background in it, and all these kind of things. So it became it was just an incredible story, because it sort of came out of our societies also. And I think this was, in the British press, how people talked about, especially these girls from Bethnal Green, these 3 15-year-olds, because you could see their image on the cameras, on the video cameras, when they were leaving. And they really looked like the teenage daughters that everyone has, right? So the shock was huge, and because the British press has this very rough way of dealing with subjects, showing their names, showing their faces, and calling them all these names you just mentioned, which didn't happen in that way, I think, in the German-speaking press, for example. But it made it a very big story suddenly, yeah? And especially the fact that these women went to a project that was so anti-feminist that you would think, like, who would voluntarily sign up to a project where you can't even go fight, unlike as you describe in your book also, in the 70s, the Palestinian, for some freedom fighters, for other terrorists, but they went, and Leila Khalid took a whole plane hostage, and she became like an icon of a whole political movement, and that was wrong in our eyes to take this plane hostage, but it was definitely a self-empowering act for a young woman. So how does this go together with what these young women did there? Why did they go?
It's an excellent question. I think it's one of the most perplexing things about the story of these women. I think it's part of why there's such a visceral reaction to them too, is how could you as women go join such a project that's so cruel to women? One is that I think propaganda really works, in the same way that, today there are people in Moscow who think that, that there isn't this exodus happening, and who have a whole different picture of the war in Ukraine than everyone else. ISIS, so many of these, from many of the countries where women and young girls went, I think there were certainly sort of bubbles of information. They didn't watch the same media that everyone else watched. When ISIS told them the media is inventing things, it's lying, it's trying to taint the name of Islam, which you see it doing on a daily basis, which of course the British tabloid press does, that was really believable to many. They didn't trust the media. The whole sort of crisis of trust that we see, I think, especially in these communities, has been lingering for longer. And then alongside that, so skepticism of the genocidal, terrible things that were happening, you had really specific, targeted messaging that the group had for women in every setting. So it catered it. It had memes. It had language. For young women in Europe who were Muslim and who wore the hijab and dealt with street harassment or discrimination, it had one message, like, come here, you'll be covered, and you can be a conservative feminist, and we accept you. And to the Arab countries who had gone through the Arab Spring and, you know, country to country been disappointed and things had regressed in Tunisia. It had special messages. You know, your revolution failed, but come here. You can, if you have a skill, bring your job. You can be part of the state building project. You can wear your headscarf without any concern. So, you know, you had the trust, the bubbles of not sort of listening to or trusting what everyone else was seeing, and at the same time, this really targeted, very sort of emotionally sophisticated messaging that I think would sort of reach into the hearts of these young women across all the platforms that they were on their phones and just pulled them in. You know, a message that, and I think this is what we see in lots of other contexts. I think jihadist militants are really skillful at promising things that they know women want, because women are so often neglected, especially in Arab countries or other countries where they were struggling in lots of ways to have political rights as citizens, political rights as women. And so they would promise all sorts of things that they had no intention of actually delivering, but that were persuasive at the point of just mobilization.
But what I found so interesting at the beginning, when young people started to go, when it became a kind of fashion, and I once interviewed an imam in Cardiff who was sort of a kind of gatekeeper for, because he was a very religious man, but absolutely not for the Islamic State. And so he had these prayer groups with him, young men only. He dealt only with the young men. But he told me how he could see when they radicalized and when he was losing the grip on their minds, when suddenly the religious teachings, he could see he couldn't reach them anymore, and how they started, the beards were going longer, the dresses were getting more traditional. And I wonder, have you had these conversations about how, because the women, you know, they also go, of course, to the mosque, and the parents probably could see that they started to radicalize in certain also obvious ways, or was it more complicated to know exactly the point when these girls, you know, would suddenly be on a plane to Istanbul?
So the parents are such an interesting, important part of this. I think many of the parents, I mean, those who had parents, because I think a common theme running throughout a lot of these young women's lives is that parents were absent, parents were neglectful, one parent was missing. You know, many of the parents saw that their girls were dressing differently, or that they were going to the mosque, or that they were covering more conservatively, but they were really relieved by that. That didn't set off alarm bells. You know, many of them
thought at least they don't take drugs and run
They
off.
thought at least, you know, one of the fathers of one of the girls said, you know, gosh, I was so relieved because she kept saying she wanted to be a fashion designer. And then she stopped saying that. And I said, oh, great, she doesn't want to be a fashion designer anymore. So they thought, you know, they were often working 3 jobs, you know, very working class. Often the mothers or the women didn't speak very much English. And they were very, very worried that their daughters would lose their religious and cultural values. So they actually thought, oh wow, someone else is doing my job for me. My daughter is, you know, studying, but she's being a very pious, good girl. So they weren't really equipped. They had no idea, I think, to spot the signs that, you know, actually, you know, there were people preying on their daughters, and that maybe they should be thinking about who was saying what to them to persuade them to do this. And I think it was, you know, the parents were often targeted in the media too. Like, why didn't they know better? Surely they were complicit, or they were sympathizing themselves. But I think often they were just, you know, they were not equipped. You know, they had come very often from small villages in Pakistan or Bangladesh, not savvy, didn't know how to negotiate any of the services, the school, and when there were so many failings in the case of these girls, they didn't even know how to navigate that. So I think it was not the sort of oversight that you would expect, but I don't think they knew what they were up against.
I mean, as a parent, I would always think you can miss a lot that goes on in your children's life, even if you are very sort of you know, present parent, and if you don't have to negotiate different cultures and the challenges of, you know, a life in London, which is a possible challenging cities for youth to grow up in. But when you spoke to the girls or young women, then later when you met them, especially the ones from Bethnal Green, our case, our base case now for this whole issue, did you understand how they made this decision, what they thought they would get out of this? I mean, you describe it in the book a little bit, but maybe you can tell us what you think was the trigger for them or the driving factor to go.
I think there was a lot of kind of collective, there's a word for this, in sort of radicalization or criminology, there's a word for these clusters in which groups sort of radicalized together. But I think for several of them, that was part of the dynamic. I mean, they had a sort of sisterhood, and I mean, they were 15, so they weren't necessarily, their brains weren't terribly developed yet to sort of judge these things, but I think there was a lot of pressure on each other, and I think they thought it was, you know, a great adventure. And I think it's kind of unavoidable that, you know, they were sort of drawn to thinking they would get married, and they had these romanticized ideas that, you know, they would meet a sort of warrior husband, so they could sort of realize some of the aspirations that I think naturally they would have had as teenagers in London, but in a path that was acceptable still within their kind of religious worldview. So I think...
were they challenging their parents as being more religious than them, or being more true to their identity or something like that?
This was a big theme, you know, and there's so young people who thought that their parents were following a kind of village Islam, and that they didn't know about proper Islam. They were listening to these preachers online, or they were listening to preachers in mosques, but at that point really more online. The mosques had kind of been monitored and cleared by that point, at least in the UK. I don't necessarily think maybe in Austria or Germany, because I think there was more kind of networks that were definitely operating through mosques. But this kind of, I think I call it in the book, this kind of urban, modern, young cosmopolitanism, the sense that they don't want to be a kind of reviled British Pakistani. That's not a very like worthy identity, but if they're a kind of global Muslim, and they're you know, they're connected to all these other Muslims through the internet, they have this identity that's really transnational, that's religious, that's more modern, compared to, you know, the Islam of their parents, which was very cultural, which was a little bit, you know, and so they got mixed into, I think, a lot of Salafi, you could call it indoctrination, a lot of Salafi proselytizing across Europe in the last 20, 30 years. That's kind of spread a lot of this version of Islam that these young people encountered or got attracted to. That's much more binary, that's much more black and white, and that, you know, I think I probably had a much more kind of mild attitude towards it in the time that I was writing this book. But I think it's a path that is, you know, when you go down it, it's hard to avoid the outcome at the end, which is a violent one.
I mean, it's very interesting because you have one of the cases in the book is this girl from Tunis. And in Tunisia, of course, you have a completely different situation to many other, you know, every Arab country, of course, is different. But Tunisia was like Turkey, going through this period of a secular regime that actively took the headscarves away from women. So Bourguiba, the president, was in, I think, 1981, telling people, that's it, you can't come to school or to work with a hijab or a scarf or any kind of. And this girl you describe, it's sort of what we have seen also in Turkey and in countries where similar development occurred over the decades. You could see that it was a way for young women to find their identity in a secular or forced secular world, and also maybe towards their mothers who didn't have a particular strong position on that, and it was a way to distinguish and find their own way. Is that what happened in that case?
Yeah, I think that's quite right. Sort of Tunisia, exactly before the first kind of uprising of the Arab Spring that sort of changed that whole order, followed that French system of extreme laicite, where the headscarf was banned. And Noor, the young woman that you mentioned, was thrown out of school for trying to wear. And Tunisia is a very conservative society still, so the idea that you would, ban women from working in government offices or attending school
was radical at the time.
It's quite, I can understand it. I come from a country that had a sort of big mid-20th century, we become modern through becoming European kind of experiment. But to take it to that extreme was kind of more than, perhaps even, Iran and Turkey went. So Noor, I think like so many young women, just ended up having a much more diminished life. She got thrown out of school for wearing her headscarf. She wouldn't give up, so she dropped out of school. And of course, Tunisia had a very brutal police apparatus, and it was a very authoritarian system. So when the Arab Spring kicked off and there was an uprising there, I think this is exactly it. This sort of the most radical elements of the uprising in Tunisia, they took Islamism as the language of their revolt. And very quickly, though, that the whole Islamist movement in Tunisia that was full of revolutionary spirit. There was a fringe of it that was quite radical, but most of it, I think, just was economically and politically really frustrated by everything that had, existed in Tunisia up until then, and they wanted more change. And very quickly, a lot of those movements were shut down because they were affiliated with, a strand of it that was violent. And so it was essentially the wholesale repression of one of the first big democratic movements of post-Arab Spring Tunisia. So out of that sort of disenchanted, angry, disappointed generation, girls like Noor were recruited really easily. But I think it was the language of their revolt. It was the language of their revolt against the police and the sort of daily grinding humiliation of the corruption of the police and the brutality of the police. So in a way, it was the language of what they wanted to push back against. And against also, I think, the idea that, really would Europe ever tolerate, an Islamist Tunisia, at its southern rim. It became a sort of test, can we, if this is our democratic outcome, will you allow us to have it?
But it's also so interesting because it happened parallel, that you had on the one hand the Arab Spring really started in Tunis with this young man who set himself on fire, demonstrating against the prices of vegetables, and against the corruption of the structures of the authorities. So on the one hand, you had a really secular revolt, and parallel to this, also the Tunisian Islamists have not been as, in their mainstream, have not been as radical as they were later on. So Ennahda is also in a way a success story for a sort of functioning Islamist government structure that they partly had. Yeah? So it's Tunis is really sort of one of the nuclear countries to watch for the development of this. And so how was it when you met Noor, and how did you meet her, and how did you put her into this whole mosaic as one stone to explain the whole story?
I met Noor through an activist or an early returnee from the conflict in Syria, who had gone to fight with Jabhat al-Nusra, which later became, they changed name 3 times. It was the Al-Qaeda affiliate. And so I met him through her because he was friends with her husband. So he had gone to fight and come back, and her husband had gone and had not come back. She had been trying to go unsuccessfully. So a contact who knew the activist friend introduced me to Noor. And I met her several times as she was kind of going through this kind of police surveillance and pressure. But her story, to me, really, it was really hard to find women whose individual stories kind of aligned with the political story I wanted to tell, because I knew that I wanted the Arab Spring and the backdrop of the Arab Spring and the failure of it to kind of be part of the backdrop of why women went from the Middle East. And sort of her story seemed actually quite perfect. I mean, she was one of the, I felt like a pearl fell into my lap with her, that she had had this experience trying to go to school, and then she was kicked out, and then she had this whole new life after the revolution, and then it all came to an end. And her husband couldn't get a job, and he went out and he protested, and there was no job for him because you had to have connections through the union. So it was a story of Tunisia and the Arab Spring, and she just sort of embodied it. And I felt lucky with her because I didn't necessarily find that with all of the context in which I wanted to sort of make the political emergence of ISIS in those places, or the pull of it, make any sense.
Well, also, I mean, if I remember correctly, because she started to go to the mosque while her mother was working, and there's a lot of these female stories in the book where the mothers are working hard and they are really trying to give the children this kind of stable life and nothing extreme from any side. And the pull to this mosque where they were so nice, and during the day they could come, and then they would sort of talk them into sort of taking a hijab and doing this and pulling in other girlfriends that they had sort of from the community. And you describe it with a lot of, understanding also. And what stays in my mind is that they felt warmth and a kind of home which they often didn't have at home, because it was just a very harsh, the circumstances were harsh. Even in this kind of, they were not super poor, they were not neglected at all. And still they decided that not to go the path of the mother, who sort of got along with the secular life, running 2 jobs, but sort of getting by. They decided to go to a much more conservative lifestyle, wrapping up and finding husbands who, Noor's husband, for example, is a little bit of a wimp, yeah? I mean, he never really makes it to a job, yeah? Connections never lead to anything, yeah? So you have the feeling Noor is probably more intelligent and able, but she chooses not to actually do anything, yeah? She drops out of school instead of going to university.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Noor ended up with someone less capable than herself, who in the end gave up and signed up with a recruiter, and thought, at least my life will have meaning if it ends there, or maybe I'll get a job and make some money and come back. The young girls who were sort of drawn into this whole circle, they were. I think they were, that warmth, I think, is something that, is really part of the grooming process, really, whether it's a gang or a criminal gang. When we look at what it is that draws young men, this camaraderie, this sense of family, being part of a unit. We were talking earlier about, what's drawing young men to fight in Ukraine, and the sense of, becoming part of a unit, becoming part of, something that's larger than yourself, but that takes you in as a member. I think, from cults to gangs to all sorts of contexts, I think it's a very human vulnerability to have that desire for connection exploited by people who want to use you.
But we see then you sort of structure the book with the biography, so you follow a few of these women from the beginning to the end of their sort of experience as ISIS brides and then widows, and in between wives or multiple wives being. So they arrive in the Islamic State, often already with their husbands, some of them alone. And you describe the scene, and it's just amazing, yeah, to think how these guest houses for these young women who arrive, and they come to a place that they have imagined quite differently, but also some of them are not unhappy at the beginning, I would say, right? And it just deteriorates very quickly over.
Yes, some of them very chillingly really enjoyed it at the beginning. Emma, the woman, the young woman from Germany, I think she really, the first 2 or 3 months, she said, oh, it was just, we used to go get hamburgers and we'd drive through the desert, and she enjoyed, you know, being able to have a gun, and, you know, the local Syrians in the village, you know, were intimidated by her, and I think she felt powerful. And some, though, immediately knew something was very wrong. You know, one of the girls from London immediately wanted to leave. She saw that it was frightening. So there were many who I think quite quickly realized this is a very sinister place. This is a place where nothing they've told me is actually bearing out, and things could go very wrong for me. But they were often very, very trapped. And yet these guest houses became a place where, you know, if their husbands were killed, they would have to go back, suffer the indignity of living, you know, 6 to a room, and sort of tormented till you would marry anyone to leave that. And then that became, you know, ever more sort of dark.
I mean, the story of Emma, for example, this German girl who then calls herself what, Dunja? Is particularly fascinating also from the point of view that we are sitting here in a German-speaking country, where you think, like, why on earth did you need to become a radical Islamist, ending up in Raqqa and being handed on from one husband to the next and all this. And in the case of Emma, she also has quite a difficult family background. So that where we follow her also descend from in an unhappy marriage, not being in all this in the middle of Germany. So it reflects also on our societies, of course, of being places that do not always take care of everyone in the way that you would want it.
Yeah, she was close to this German rapper as well, who actually, in a way, his sort of family story parallels hers. He was the son of a...
What's his name?
Deso Dog was his,
exactly.
was his hip-hop name, and then he became Abu Talha al-Almani. So he had a very unhappy childhood in Germany, where his father had been stationed. And then he sort of became a gangster rapper and a bit of a criminal on the streets of Berlin, and then kind of took that whole life into the jihad. So I think she and he were similar in that they were just, they were deeply unhappy, very sort of self-destructive, you know, trying to cope with having never had any family safety and security. And just kind of flailing out in the world, but very combative and very angry, and looking to sort of punish others for, you know, just some channel for that anger. And, you know, people like that, I don't know how we can even, you know, there will always be really broken families and really unhappy children, and they may always be preyed upon by groups that say, well, that's a really vulnerable person, it's a good target for us. But it is sort of extraordinary that then they're sort of catapulted, you know, across into the Levant, into the middle of this war that has nothing to do with them, and become recruiters. And I don't know if we've ever seen anything like it. And he was the one who the FBI agent came out to marry, which is another, you know, extraordinary sort of spy tale. You know, was she infiltrating him? Was she a double agent? So this blonde FBI interpreter fell in love with the rapper, and traveled all the way to Syria and married him, and stayed with him for 6 months, and then somehow left and went back to Washington, D.C. and got a very shortened sentence and a whole identity change. And I don't know if we'll ever know what was really going on behind that story, but clearly he was charismatic.
Yeah, and she was kind of lucky because most of the women who ended up going to Islamic State didn't have really a great time, and also are getting punished. But one of the things that I thought was very interesting in the story of Emma, that you describe how the women of European descent were treated better than the Arab women who ended up there. And what was the reason, you think, that because there's this debate between the women in the guest house where they say, well, maybe because they took a bigger, longer trip on them to come here, so the leadership of the Islamic State thinks they should be treated, get more perks or something. Yeah, all these perks, of course, were in any case not great, but considering. Yeah. But so you describe basically a very quickly developing class system of women of different backgrounds, and the Europeans being sort of the first class wives.
Yes, so they got to jump to the front of the queue for bread and for different things that they needed, and they got to. There was a big fight over who got to choose the best villas and the best houses and who got the best SUVs. I think certainly the Europeans, they at the beginning could go to the front of the queue and they had a sort of special status. But amongst the Arabs, it was very similar. There was, the Saudis are, treated better because they're wealthy. And so all the sort of inter-Arab rivalries and resentments were brewing too, about the Gulfies versus, the North Africans versus the others. And so, some would lament this and say, oh, well, we've just imported all of the prejudice of the nation-state system with us, into the caliphate, and it will take us 3 generations to work this out of our systems. It's natural. But yeah, it was very striking to see the kind of immediate descent into rivalries based on, sort of global South, Europe, inter-Arab. Although now, I guess, sort of fittingly, they're all in the same detention death camp in Syria. Now they're completely leveled and very equal, and they're kept separated, but they are not given trials, they have no access to health care really meaningfully, their children are not in school, so they now all enjoy the sort of same kind of destitute, kind of cast into hell status of like these camps that are forgotten about. So now they're finally all the same.
So how is the situation now? Because some people could leave, some people are sort of trying to get out. There's a big debate that the UK government had about Shamima Begum, one of the 3 girls from Bethnal Green. She's still not back. She's still there. So how big is this problem? How many people are we even talking about? Where are they from? Where are we standing there?
There's about 12,000 women and children who are neither Syrian nor Iraqi. So they come from 52 different countries, and about 2,000 or 3,000 of them are Western, so European, Canadian, Australian. So it's a sizable amount.
But part of these 2,000-3,000 are also sort of, which is sort of a sub-story in this whole thing, which I find totally interesting. Also this Frantz Fanon thought that the marks of the colonial system are still on some of the sort of descendants, sort of these British girls who come from Pakistani families, who have come from families where sort of, a British colonial system was lying over their family histories, and how they then sort of came to Syria, and in their way then also sort of established a kind of colonial system within these structures to also feel better than others from different descents. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to think in what a small period of time all this happened, and you got to observe it and sort of also understand it that way.
That sort of, I also found that quite fascinating, the kind of, the children of Europe's old colonies, essentially. The French were mostly, from North Africa, second, third generation. From Germany, very many Turks, although not a colony, but a sort of post-World War II experiment in having guest worker non-citizens that went poorly at the time. And sort of I think, internalized, I totally agree with the Fanonian kind of psychoanalytical reading of what they were doing, basically. But it's a question now of, these countries that have stripped them of their citizenship, essentially rendering some of them stateless. What does that mean about the citizenship of second and third generation children of immigrants who are theoretically maybe eligible for another citizenship but may not have it and can't go back? So this is a kind of very specific problem that reflects, these complicated histories of these countries that have come together in the lives of these men and women, but it's kind of unresolvable still.
Well, I mean, there is a solution where the British government, for example, brings Shamima Begum back and says, okay, she cannot get a Bangladeshi citizenship because it was lost over, she never had it, and they have no intention to give it to her. So the only actual state citizenship that she could get is the British one. So how far is this process to? Is there any chance she will get it? Because there's a lot of, you read about it again and again, and there doesn't seem to be much progress.
Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to imagine that she would be allowed to go back because she's become such a hate figure and such a sort of monster figure that the political cost of bringing her back, certainly for a weakened government like what the UK has now, there would be no reason to take that. And there's no real constituency for these women anywhere, really. I mean, there are some sort of, the same sort of human rights advocates who made the same, who had advocacy around, let's not torture people at Guantanamo, let's, follow the rule of law. Those human rights groups and those advocates are making those cases, but it's at a time when that's so politically unpalatable. Even though from a security perspective, it's very dangerous because these camps are porous. You can buy your way out of them. It happens regularly every single week. And these women kind of pitch up, or these men pitch up in Turkey, and then, a very famous Belgian case where a young man tried to be brought back to Belgium. He had been stripped of his citizenship. He got to Turkey. He went to the Belgian embassy. He filmed himself on Instagram. I am here, take me back. The lengths, though, to which I think most European governments will go to avoid this are very, unless in a specific court case, a successful case is made by a lawyer and a family that on a case-by-case basis obliges a government to repatriate. I mean, I think the hope is, there was that prison riot, what was it, a month and a half ago now, where ISIS took over the prison for 3 days. There were 700 boy children in that facility, some Australian boys, boys from Western countries. And you could see that, I think very cynically, the hope is just, maybe some of these kids will die, maybe there will be more raids, but it's very dangerous. These are not secure places, and growing up in them, having spent 5 years in them, I mean, what will these children be?
Oh God, it's not even to think about. But so would you think, their chances to be sent home, even the children, completely innocent of this whole thing, will not be taken back by the cities where these people come from?
Slowly, some countries are bringing back children on their own. France favors that policy. Mothers understandably don't wish it because the children are their last chance to be brought back themselves. Arguably, is it better for the child to be brought? But then, I think the resettlement of them in countries like France isn't going terribly well. In some cases, children are really stigmatized. So then local municipalities tend not to want to take any more. So it's very, but at the same time, many hundreds of people have come back on their own, and all of the social care services and security services are dealing with them. So surely just a few more, are just added to a massive caseload that's already being undertaken.
Well, in a sense, maybe better than to create a whole camp of radicalized youth, second generation, post-Islamic State, inventing who God knows what type of new radical theory about the world. But so France takes children, but not the mothers. Wouldn't it be better if they stayed together? If these children being orphaned sort of twice probably also doesn't help their psychological.
Yeah, the argument
state.
that the governments make is that probably they would separate them anyway, because the mother is considered neglectful or unfit for having taken her child there or having joined such a group. But that's not always the case. I'm in touch with one of the earliest cases in the UK, a young woman who went, she's very stupid, she put pictures of her kid up there, and then they came back and she went to prison. Her son was taken away for 2 years while she was in prison. And now she's out and she has visitation rights with him again, and there is a future beyond their separation. Children grow up, mothers jailed, sentences, they conclude, unless there's battlefield evidence, which for most of these women there is not. They will do between 2 to 4 years of prison time. So, there is a future for these broken families after this. But I think, the trajectory of the last 2 or 3 years is not encouraging.
Is there a difference between, for example, the German or Austrian government, how they deal? Are they taking families back? There was this famous case in Austria in 2019 where the grandparents said they would want to take their grandchildren at least and bring them home. Where are we standing in these cases? Do you know that?
So I know in the German system, it's very much still on a case-by-case basis. So if a family can sue successfully on grounds that either the child is in ill health or the mother is in health, on a case-by-case basis. But there's been a little bit of movement, I think, more with Germany than with the UK certainly, and with France. So I think slowly, there might be some openings. Austria, I'm not sure, but I think the grandparents are, in many countries are very organized, and they're the ones who are bringing the court cases. They go to this camp, they travel all the way there to try and, see their daughters.
That's miserable. Because I called the foreign ministry in Austria to find out what the numbers are, and I was told there are actually 6 cases, 6 women and some children, and it's really not, especially now, there's a completely different story now with the Ukrainian war. People are really busy and don't assign much attention to this particular problem. But that's the problem also with the capacities that also governments have to deal with it. And of course, nobody wants to get a radicalized bunch of crazy people who might then not integrate at all into their old society. I mean, do you have any experience with the cases that have been coming home, if they actually understand and realize now that they were a bit on the wrong track there, or are they still, maybe disenchanted with Islamic State, but still quite radical in their political opinions?
It's a very good question. It's something that is quite hard to gauge. I mean, I think there's lots of countries that have taken more women and children back that have had quite successful integration programs, and there's work that's been done on those, and there's better practices evolving, and techniques and ways of helping women reintegrate. And so it's getting better and better, actually, as time goes on. I think governments and social services are learning, how to support and help this reintegration. I don't think there's been any crime committed by a woman who's returned from the Syrian conflict. So in terms of security threats, it's very complicated to monitor, though, and it's laborious. But in terms of how it's actually, I think many women may still in their minds harbor some thoughts that are angry at the West. I think they're probably very disenchanted with the Islamic State. Most. I think there's a sort of radical core in these camps that are still very fierce. But so many of these women went when they were very young, and then they had children, and then they just kind of grew up, and their priorities changed, and they want to take care of their children. And so they're just at a kind of different phase of their lives. So even if politically they might still think that, the West is quite predatory and Islam is, always being, or Muslim people are always being victimized, in this kind of grand political narrative, I don't think that they see themselves as being, part of a, jihadist project anymore.
I mean, it's quite interesting when you're last seen with Noor in Tunis. I mean, she never actually sort of became the poster child of in the Islamic State, but she is there working in a shoe shop at the end of the story that we know from her so far, and she's has no hijab, and she's sort of, you see her hair for the first time, and she's beautiful, and you would think like, oh, how nice, yeah, maybe this is a good story, and then you talk to her, and she's actually completely bitter and thinks that religion is the answer, but she cannot work in the shoe shop otherwise, or something in this direction. Yeah? So it's quite disappointing then to see. So okay, no happy end here.
Well, so no happy ending, but at least she's pragmatic. So in the security language, she's disengaged, and I think that's the best we can hope for. Disengaged is good. That means that even if she has radical political views, she doesn't want to resolve them through violence, and she doesn't want to get personally involved. So, in a way, that's
it's good as it gets.
That's a good outcome. Well, I think, like looking at the reaction to Ukraine, and thinking about what refugees who came from Syria and Afghanistan went through, I think it's a really painful time. I mean, seeing. There are refugee kids in the UK who came from Syria, and then they got bullied and they got waterboarded at their schools. I mean, it's just heartbreaking to think, to leave that violence and leave your home and then just be reviled and physically mistreated. And so I think when you watch all of that, the pull of these jihadist grand narratives is strong. You sort of see, really, is our humanity the same? And I think with every cycle of violence, or this kind of exceptionalism of certain types of suffering, I think it feeds into that kind of narrative that Noor in the end sympathizes with.
Do we know anything about the fate of Emma, who is a very strong part of the book also, the German girl?
Yes, Emma, who wanted to bring her cats with her when she was escaping in the middle of the night. So Emma has managed to get herself back to Germany. I don't know what she's doing. She wanted to have a cosmetology business because she was just obsessed with makeup and her appearance, despite everything. So I hope to find out what's happened to her. But she wrote a book in German.
So we can have a look at that.
Yes, because, I sort of actually encouraged her. This is the one positive act that perhaps, apart from this book, I contributed to, because we talked on the phone and messaged endlessly for the better part of 2 years. And she would groan a lot. Journalists are so exploitative, and they just want to take your story and suck the blood out of you. And I said, well,
Which is mostly true also.
Which is mostly true. I totally agree. I know, we have to admit. But I said, well, why don't you write your own story? Just write your own story. They will sell a lot. And she said, oh, okay, maybe I will. And then she found, I think, a Reuters journalist who co-wrote it with her, and she sold it. And so she is a published author, actually. So she goes back to that, if not anything else.
So some of these biographies we could hope sort of manage to have a post-Islamic State widow life.
Yes.
And get out of it. But we would also hope that governments take responsibility as much as they can, even if it's very painful, to bring people back who have lost track of their own citizenship for a while. But we would hope that they would make an attempt to reintegrate them rather than leaving them there.
I think it's a lost opportunity. Although I understand the politics of it, and elected politicians, always, are looking at the next election cycle. But, seeing the way that the Islamic State has spun out into a franchise that is successful in Mozambique, that's successful in the Lake Chad region, that's successful in Afghanistan. ISIS in Afghanistan is recruiting young women who are disenchanted with the Taliban and the New Order. I mean, it's sort of watching the same thing happen over and over again. If you had the opportunity to sort of take what is a very central part of its propaganda is these camps of shame and humiliation. If you just could end that, it would sort of extinguish such a key part of their propaganda. It would sort of shut that down. And what a powerful thing that would be. So, to me, it seems like the right thing to do in so many ways, but clearly, as a political calculation, it must seem like the wrong thing.
Well, let's hope that your view gets heard. Ladies and gentlemen, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde des Kreisky-Forums, many thanks for coming. Azadeh, the Guesthouse for Young Widows is available in English in your trusted bookshop around the corner from Vienna to London. And I hope we get to see you again very soon, because we would like to be kept up with the development in this topic and also many other topics that you work on. And in that sense, I thank you very much for coming. I thank you very much for coming, everyone. Good evening.
Thank you, Tessa. It was such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.